Of demonstrators have disrupted the progress of the Olympic torch on its relay across London. There were repeated clashes between police and human rights protesters demanding a boycott of the Beijing Games. More than 35 people have been arrested. Thousands of spectators turned out to watch the procession.
A subdued ceremony in an empty stadium. This was not the celebration China had wanted. And as Sir Steve Redgrave carried the torch out, the trouble started. Demonstrators tried to board the waiting bus and were wrestled away by the police.
Stop the torch going into Tibet, please! Gordon Brown, I urge you, stop the torch going into Tibet!
The lady carrying
the disruptions began within minutes and kept on coming.
Brought down in front of the torch.
One demonstrator used a fire extinguisher. Another tried to snatch the torch.
Oh, someone, as I speak, someone has tried to grab the torch from Connie Huck, the former Blue Peter presenter. A man has tried to grab the torch. He's been hauled to the ground by police officers. He did have his hands on the torch.
With 2 rings of protection, Chinese officials inside, Metropolitan Police outside, the torch battled through. But there were hundreds of demonstrators waiting on the route ahead.
We can argue about a sporting and a political issue, but this is a moral issue. We're talking about torture, we're talking about lack of human rights. That's more important than politics, and that's more important than sport.
The Chinese ambassador took the torch through Chinatown. It wasn't what was planned, but then the day wasn't going the way it was intended. It was a tour of London's landmarks. In Trafalgar Square, the torch took the plinth, the protesters the fountains. And it was the demonstrators' message, not China's, that was being beamed out to the world. Along Whitehall, pro- and anti-Chinese demonstrators came face to face.
It's a student from China, and we are Chinese, and we are proud of our country hosting the Olympics in Beijing this year.
It's our right to proud of my own country. They have no business to stop us to wave our own flag.
But as the torch approached Downing Street, there were repeated scuffles between police and demonstrators. The torch itself was all but invisible as hundreds jeered its passage. The point of parading it in public was lost. Inside the security cordon of Downing Street, Gordon Brown watched as the flame was handed on. But although he shook hands with everyone, he didn't touch the torch itself. The government's participation was carefully calibrated.
The welcome of the Olympic torch to London is not the same as condoning the human rights regime in China or condoning the treatment of Tibet.
Paula Radcliffe, the marathon runner, led the way to the east of London, where the 2012 Olympics will be held. By now, protection for the torch had been stepped up. But many of the torchbearers sympathised with the protesters. Sir Steve Redgrave saw the day as an object lesson in democratic protest, one China might learn from.
It's our nature of being very open within this country that protesters can make their point, and as an athlete, I'm pleased that that's happening.
The yachtswoman Dame Ellen MacArthur carried the torch downriver to the O2 Dome, where many prominent supporters of the Olympic movement were waiting. Among them Princess Anne and London's Mayor Ken Livingstone. For many of those involved, the dilemma posed today could be answered with one question. Who would benefit most from the publicity surrounding the event? The Chinese government or those who oppose it? Brian Hanrahan, BBC News.
Well, images of the torch relay and the protests have been seen around the world, but in China, coverage of events here in London was strictly controlled. James Reynolds reports from Beijing.
Every night, from on high, the Communist Party delivers the news. Tonight's most important story is the state of the modern tractor and the progress of socialism in the countryside. Then a few minutes later, there is brief mention of the torch relay in London and how well it's going. You won't get to see any pictures of the disruption to the Olympic torch relay if you watch this channel. The Chinese Communist Party has a simple rule. It won't show any pictures which ruin this country's idea of a trouble-free games. So we ask, does anyone here know about the scuffles in London? I haven't heard anything, this man says. I've read that everyone supports the Olympics, his wife adds. It shouldn't get mixed up with anything else. Her husband agrees. I haven't heard anything, says this man. Is it something to do with the Dalai? Sport and politics should be kept separate. China insists on keeping bad news away from its citizens. James Reynolds, BBC News, Beijing.